Hey, thank you so much for watching or listening. We're really excited. I'm really excited about this series that I'm doing about seeing Jesus. And the question is, how do you see Jesus? In what lens do you see Jesus? You know, I talked in my last episode about looking at Jesus. One of my friends who is very meticulous and cautious, and I found out later that she loves fast cars. You know, some of my friends, they're like, hey, Sarah, they kind of, as they get to know me over time, they're like, I never knew. And it's like you kind of unpack, you unlayer people. And I think it's possible that we could do that as well with Jesus. In the last episode, we talked about Jesus as our healer and as our provider. And let's be sure that we're open to that, that our resources and our identity and our pursuits, our solutions, we see Jesus to help us with our health, with our provisions and our needs. But I also want you to think about this. I think that's a really interesting example of a person who expands their awareness, experience, interaction, and their knowledge, intimacy, connection with Jesus. Starts off kind of just as you would think, in an acquaintance mode, so to speak. And so I want us to look specifically at one person today, and this is the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. You're like, Sarah, you always talk about her. I do because she is so astounding to me. And I find her amazing and so relevant, helpful to us in our modern living. I think a lot of who she is and her behavior, her mindset, many of us can relate to in various ways and aspects. And so when she first meets Jesus, this is in John chapter 4, verse 7, Jesus comes to Samaria. If you remember, Samaria is kind of the dregs of Israel. Everybody looks down. The Jews look down on the Samaritans, all that stuff. And Jesus comes into the area of Samaria, and he sits down by a well, and a woman comes to draw water, and he says to her, give me a drink. I'm thirsty. I want a drink of water. And her reply to him is, how is it, and this is verse 9, how is it that you, a Jewish man, would talk to me, a Samaritan woman? So her first awareness of Jesus is just from what she sees, just kind of the external observation. I'm a Samaritan woman, you're a Jewish man. And normally, these two groups, pockets, they don't interact. And you are going against all the cultural norms. And so how do you see Jesus? You know, is he kind of this cold, distant theologian that was, kind of removed and isolated from human interaction, and this lady didn't know who Jesus was from the man on the moon. All she saw him as, her initial introduction was a Jewish man, and that's it. And maybe some of us were watching, listening, maybe that's how we have seen or experienced or been aware of Jesus, just from a remote distance and kind of just in the broad strokes of a guy who lived a long time ago in Israel, Jewish, something like that. But as you give Jesus opportunity, conversation, you move from this just broad strokes, kind of out here acquaintance, just by what you see and kind of what you hear, you move a little bit deeper. And he says, and he invites the conversation to deepen. And I believe that Jesus wants both you and me to know him in more depth than we currently know him. And I say that based on his interaction with the Samaritan woman. If he didn't want her to know him, then he would have just said, zip it and give me some water. But he didn't. I believe Jesus wants us to know him in a deeper way. And if you're watching and listening right now and you've been doing this whole Jesus thing for a long time, there's still room for you to grow and deepen your relationship with Jesus. If you're watching, you're listening right now, and you're just kind of on the surface and you're like, never heard of the dude before, or just minimal. I thought he was the little person down the road, that was whatever. I didn't really know. But we can deepen, we can get closer, we can get to know Jesus more in greater depth. So he says to her in verse 10, after she asks the question, how is it you, a Jewish man, talks to me, a Samaritan woman? And he replies, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that's talking to you, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. And she's like, okay. She goes with him on this conversational journey. And I believe that Jesus is inviting you into a deeper conversational journey. And for you to know Jesus in ways that you haven't known him before. And having conversations and depths and experiences and connections with Jesus that you haven't had before. And if you think about this whole conversation, it starts around a water well in the middle of the day. Something common. And here's a woman who's coming to draw water. That's what they did every day, at least once or twice a day. And it's in her normal routine. And I want to encourage you that we can know Jesus in the context of our normal daily routines. We can have conversations and deepening connections with Jesus. I believe he invites us to expand our awareness, our connection, deepen that with him in these conversations, just in the day-to-day living that we have. And he says to her, I would give you living water. And she's like, okay, let's go with that. And so there's a deepening awareness, expanding connection with Jesus over the course of this conversation. Starts off really broad, Samaritan woman, Jewish man. Then he's like, well, I would give you living water. So he brings it in closer to himself. She's like, living water? Where the heck are you going to get that? And he said, well, and she talks about how, the context, our father Jacob, all this well stuff. And then Jesus says in verse 13, whoever drinks from this water, the well that you're pulling up water from, will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst, but it will become in him a river of living water, springing up to living water. And so he keeps pressing close and opening the door for deeper conversation, interaction, connection, communion. And I think Jesus does this with us. And I think we have to be open to the idea that Jesus is inviting us to deeper conversations, to deeper relationships, to more connection, to have more fellowship, communion, intimacy. This is who Jesus is. He always wants more with us. If he just wanted kind of that superficial drink of water, he wouldn't have continued to have this conversation. And he's the one that deepens the conversation. He's the one that whets her appetite. And she gets increasingly more and more curious as Jesus continues to talk with her. And I think that's a really powerful thing for us to consider. Are we increasingly curious? Are we increasingly hungry for more of Jesus? I don't care if you've been doing this gig for 40, 50, 70 years. I don't care if you just kind of barely met Jesus and he's that philosopher dude from way back in the day. I don't care where we're at on that spectrum, on that journey. Are we still hungry? Are we still curious? Because Jesus is continually inviting us. And maybe the experiences that we have in our life are invitations from Jesus to grow deeper, closer, more connected. And Jesus says to her, he's like, go and call your husband. And she's like, woof. Well, that's a hot topic. We're not going to go down that rabbit trail. Well, I have no husband. I mean, she suddenly gets super concise and abrupt compared to her chatty Kathy before. And Jesus says, you're right. You have 5 husbands and the guy you're with now isn't your husband. And she's like, And it's this deepening relationship, deepening connection. So it's expanding. And I love what happens because it's not only that Jesus reveals who she is, but he also tells her. And she says, I perceive that you're a prophet. Brilliant. Genius, right? Like, he just kind of read your mail. And he says, well, and she says, I perceive you're a prophet. And we know that when Messiah comes, he will reveal all things to us. And Jesus says, "Your I who speak with you am he." And so it's this, and this intimacy and connection continues to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And she goes into the conversation. She continues to move into it. And he totally hits the very core, central, raw nerve in her life, as well as telling her who he really, really is. And so I just invite you in this episode to really consider a deepening conversation with Jesus. Maybe you've had those external ones. Maybe you've had the spiritual conversations. Maybe you've had Jesus reveal some things to you in terms of your health or healing or provision, but deepening. And here's my question to you. I would ask you to consider this. How could you go deeper with Jesus? Where do you have questions? What are you curious about with Jesus? These are some things for you to think about and answer. Give me some feedback. I'd be really keen to hear that. And of course, I want to thank you for subscribing and hit the notification bell right there. Give you new content when we post that. And here is your finishing joke, which I know you're like, woo! And some of you are like, we're tuning out because we don't need that kind of goofiness. What happens when a frog's car dies? It gets towed. Oh my God. I know, so bad. But we know next week is going to be a lot better. Thanks again.